Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum, and I'm here today at Morphy's with this massive Soviet DShK heavy machine gun. This is the Soviet 50 caliber machine gun, and this is specifically a model of 1938. It is the original pattern as it was produced, as it was used in World War II. Not long after, in fact, in the final days of World War II, this would be significantly modified. A whole new feed system was developed for it, a bunch of other changes made, and it became the DShK-M. And that's the version that is predominant today. To find one in its original 1938 pattern is pretty darned awesome. So let's do a little bit of background on this. In 1925, the Revolutionary Military Council of the Soviet Union, the USSR, had a meeting and came to the conclusion that they needed to develop a heavy machine gun, something between 12 and 20 millimeter for use primarily on aircraft. This is really fairly similar to the developmental history of the American 50 caliber, what would be the Browning M2. The Americans saw this as a weapon for use against armored vehicles and aircraft, which were becoming more armored every year. The Soviet Union saw the same thing, but had a focus on aircraft. They thought that anything, any other uses for the gun would be great, but there shouldn't be any design choices that make it less effective against aircraft in favor of anything else. So they start doing some experiments. They're working a little bit with the British 50 Vickers cartridge. They actually do some adaptation to a German Dreyse machine gun, and it's not clear to me exactly which one. This may be a confusion with the German Tank und Flieger Maxim guns. Maybe, I'm not sure. But they used an adapted German gun for some of their initial trials, weren't happy with it. By 1929, they're doing military maneuvers, and they realized that, wow, we've got low-flying aircraft, aircraft under like 1,500 meters elevation, and we really need a heavy anti-aircraft machine gun to address this potential threat. So who do we have that can just get this done? Degtyarev. They go to Vasily Degtyarev, who has basically just finished rolling out production of his DP27, DP28 light machine gun, which would be a very successful gun that the Soviet Union would use for several decades. They go, all right, you finished that one, now make it bigger. And Degtyarev is able to basically whip out this design pretty quickly. By 1930, he's got the DK, which is, the K is heavy machine gun, the D is Degtyarev. He's got it ready to go, but it's not quite satisfactory. The biggest issue with it is he gave it a 30-round magazine, and it's this big clunky drum magazine that sits on top, and that, along with some of the other mechanical elements of the gun, meant that it had a pretty darn low rate of fire. It was like 360 rounds per minute. That's fine for some tasks, but if you're trying to hit a fast-moving, low-flying aircraft, a higher rate of fire is going to be much more effective. That's what you want to go for. And so there's a little bit of an impasse. They build a handful of DK machine guns. They try them out. It's just not quite working. And they end up bringing in another designer. This is something that the Soviet Union would periodically do. They had design bureaus that would sometimes compete against each other and sometimes collaborate. And another designer by the name of Georgiy Shpagin, whom you may recognize from the PPSH submachine gun. He is the SH, Shpagin. In Russian, that's a single letter. In English, that's split into two letters, S and H. Shpagin came in and he solved the problem with Degtyarev's machine gun. He developed this belt feed mechanism that basically just clamps up on top of the existing action that Degtyarev had designed, and this was able to bring the rate of fire up almost double to like 600 rounds a minute, which was quite satisfactory. It was reliable, it was belt fed, it took the really clunky drum magazines out of the equation. Now you could just have an ammo can full of belted ammunition, makes things much simpler. And with that change, the gun would proceed into trials. It was trialed in, trials would last until the late 1930s. The last one in 1938, and then in February of 1939, this was formally adopted by the Soviet Union as the DShK. The K is heavy machine gun, and now it's got two inventor initials attached to it, Degtyarev and Shpagin. They adopt it as the model 1938. Production begins in 1939, and this is in fact a 1939 production gun, which is so cool. with the first guns actually reaching troops in 1940. So let's take a closer look. Let me show you how this whole thing works, and then we'll talk about what ended up happening to them. All right, let's start by looking at how to operate the gun, and then we'll go ahead and take it apart. Now, first thing, we've got this nice big armored shield. This is hardened armor plate. Looks like it's about 5 millimeters thick, about 1/4 inch. I am quite certain that that will stop a .30 caliber rifle round just fine. That's there for the protection of the gun and the crew, but it's going to get in the way of me showing you a whole lot. So let's start by taking this off. That's actually really easy to do. We've got these two latches right there. Just lift them into the vertical position, and then you can just lift the shield right off. All right, now we've got some space to work with. So first, moving the gun around. We've got two crank handles. In fact, you'll see that this sort of lever screw folding crank thing is really quite common on this gun. They use these things all over the place. We've got a pivot, basically a friction lock here to pivot the gun, and a friction lock here, which tightens down this. This big wheel is actually connected to the mount. We'll take the gun off in a minute and you'll see that. But this is for elevation, so if I crank that up a bit, like so, now I can pivot the gun up and down, tighten it back, and then if I open this one up, that allows me to rotate the gun around. Next up, we have a folding rear sight here. It folds down out of the way. There were anti-aircraft sights, and in fact, this gun has some of the anti-aircraft sight components with it, but not quite everything, so I can't mount it to show you. But to use the standard ground sights, you just lift this up, and then we have a pretty standard sort of rear notch sight. If I squeeze these two buttons in, I can raise and lower this quickly, and then I have this screw dial for small, precise adjustment. The front sight is a pretty basic round post there, adjustable for elevation and for windage. So you can zero the gun out here. The barrels are removable. This allows you to independently zero each barrel. A quick look at the markings here. We have our serial number. We have the date of production, which is 1939, which is extremely early. This is the first year of actual production. And we have the arrow insignia of the cover of Arsenal. The barrel is also dated. That's a 1940 barrel, also very early. Now, moving on to operation, let's take a look at our feed system. We have a big stamped feed cover here that lifts up, and there's a little spring-loaded catch right there to hold it in the upward position so it doesn't fall back on you. And all you have to do is pull it to snap it out of position. This is the system that Shpagin came up with for feeding the Degtyarev gun. This is a rotating spindle that is going to take a belt. In fact, we actually pull that off to the side. The belt is going to come up here, go across this spindle. This tab right here, which is much more visible from this side, this tab right here is going to pop rounds out of the belt, drop them into these trays, and then rotate them through. When they get to the bottom position of the spindle, they are in position to be picked up by the bolt as it goes forward. Empty cases are then ejected out the bottom of the gun. So here's what the belt looks like, top and bottom. It clamps cartridges in place around the front and the back of the case. Notice that the center of the case right here is left open. That tab will slip right between the belt and the case and pop the cartridge out of the belt. For the record, the cartridge that this uses is the Soviet 12.7 by 108 millimeter. It's 50 caliber, 108 millimeters long. Here is a US 50 caliber for comparison. This is 12.7 by 99, so it's 9 millimeters shorter. Slightly less powerful, but not really to the extent that anyone could tell the difference. The case heads are significantly different though, so these two cartridges are in no way interchangeable. There is some lore out there, like really old dumb lore about how, you know, their cartridge was usable in our guns but not vice versa. That's all nonsense. These two cartridges are totally not interchangeable. Anyway, once the cartridge has been popped into this, the bolt is going to pull the spindle around and the belt is simply going to feed out the other side empty. In order to smoothly feed those cartridges, we have a belt box mount, a bracket right here. There's a spring-loaded button that will lock it in place. So my ammo can, and this is a pretty old ratty ammo can, but it has two mounting bars right there. I'm going to slide that right over the bracket, push the latch button in, there we go. That locks the ammo can in place. You can close that. The front of the ammo can will actually tilt out nicely to give us a nice smooth feed tray up into the gun, and then we can close the top of the can. Again, this is an old ratty one that's kind of bent up, but what you see here is that the can can be closed, debris is not going to fall into your belted ammunition, and you have just a little bit of an opening here to feed a belt right into the gun. Next up, charging the gun. We actually have a primary charging handle right here under the spade grips, but this is part of the mount, not actually part of the gun. That said, it is definitely the easiest way to actually charge this thing because it lets you put your whole weight into it. So I've pulled this back, the bolt's going to lock open, run that forward. The DshK runs from an open bolt, so this, if it had ammunition, and if I had run cartridges, enough cartridges, I believe it's 2, to actually cycle it into position where the bolt will pick up the first cartridge, this would now be ready to run. Notice here that we have this big lug that is connected to the bolt carrier of the gun. So as the bolt carrier cycles, that lug is going back and forth, and that is actually what's going to cycle the feed system. So when I pull this back, it pulls this cam all the way back. If I do this with the top cover open, you can see we have almost a revolver-like little hand and pawl there that act to rotate that cartridge feed spindle one position with each operation of the bolt. Now, in case the mount is, I suppose, broken, although it's basically just giant chunks of steel, I'm not sure how exactly it would break, but if you have the gun mounted in some other platform, perhaps that doesn't have this charging handle, you do need some way to charge it, and that's what this is. That is actually sized to hold a piece of 50 Soviet, 50 Russian brass, locks it in place, and this is your charging handle. Now, I'm not going to do that with a live round because that's potentially shouldn't be dangerous, but I'm not going to do it. This is meant to be done with a piece of empty brass. All right, now let's take the gun out of its mount so that we can disassemble it. I've got a rear locking pin right here. Notice again this sort of folding screwdrivery deal built into the pin. This one just comes completely out. It's going to lift up against its anti-aircraft sight mount there. And then we have 2 more clasps in the front. So what I'm going to do here is just loosen this. Once it's loose enough, this comes down and I can lift up that block, and there's the front trunnion, one of the 2 front trunnions of the gun. Do the same thing on that side, lift it up, and then we can just lift the gun up. By the way, DshK in its standard configuration like this, 74 pounds. With the gun off, you can now get a better view of the actual tripod mounting system here. We've got a brass deflector here to kick cases out. We've got our charging handle right there. This just hooks in front of the bolt carrier to pull it back, and it's got a little spring latch to hold it forward. You do have the actual legs. They're not just a single recoil trail. You can spread these out, stand the whole thing up as an anti-aircraft mount, but I'm not going to do that right now. Nope, it is time for disassembly. So we're going to start by punching this pin out. With this out, we can now take the grip assembly off. That is just going to slide down off the receiver, like, yeah, we do have the bolt forward, that's important. There we go. There's the grip frame. This plunger is actually going to operate the ejector. This is a buffer for absorbing the impact of the bolt, and then that is the trigger. Very simple. Next up, we just pull off the sear unit. So when the trigger pushes this bar up, that sear drops down. So that's the firing mechanism. We have a safety selector here. I probably should have mentioned that earlier. This is the fire position. It's really stiff. That is the safe position. It is particularly interesting to notice that on this one, the safety selector markings have been milled off and re-stamped in Finnish. There's no other specific provenance to Finland that I can see on this gun, but this was absolutely done in Finland during World War II. This part, at least, was captured during either the Winter War or the Continuation War. I can't say for sure if this whole gun was captured or if the gun came into the US from somewhere else and had a replacement Finnish sear block put on it, but that is super cool. Anyway, the next step in disassembly is to disengage the mainspring. With a gun like this, we do not want to have to recompress the mainspring into the gun just for disassembly, so we can leave it actually captive inside the gas piston assembly. And we do that by grabbing this knurled section, pulling it forward, rotating it, and you've got this little block right here that locks into and unlocks from the barrel. So with it in this position, the whole spring and bolt carrier can slide out the back of the gun. Here's that step up close again so you can see it. Pull this forward, rotate it out, and let it back. And now I'll lift the feed cover out of the way to keep this claw disengaged from this, and I can now slide the whole bolt carrier gas piston spring assembly out the back of the gun. So this operates basically just like all of the other Degtyarev guns. It is flapper locked, so when the bolt comes back in the carrier, these two flaps extend, they lock into recesses in the receiver, and because this fires from an open bolt, what's going to happen when you pull the trigger is this whole assembly is going to be pushed forward by the main spring inside the gas, or around the gas piston. The breech face here is going to hit the barrel face. That's going to push the bolt back. These are going to lock in position, and then the very last bit of travel is spring-loaded, and at that point the firing pin will protrude out and fire. We can see that right there. Now, where this differs a little bit from some of the other Degtyarevs is that we have this spring-loaded plunger on top. That is actually the ejector. So when the whole thing is cycling rearward, the firing pin is retracted, the locking flaps are retracted in. This is going to hit this protrusion on the grip frame right there, and that is going to punch out the empty case, pushing it downward, ejecting it through the bottom of the receiver and through this open ejection slot in the bolt carrier. Production of the DshK was actually pretty slow during World War II. It's really interesting to compare this to the US M2, which the US made hundreds of thousands of during World War II. The Soviet Union, by the beginning of 1942, they had a grand total of 720 of these. By the end of World War II, they still had only about 9,000 of them. So they were really actually pretty low production guns. The United States would use its 50 caliber guns on everything. We put them on trucks, we put them on tanks, we used scads of them in aircraft, fighters, bombers, everything. Any place we could slap an M2, it got an M2. The Soviet Union was much more reserved in its issuing of DshKs. These were primarily for anti-aircraft use. They were a pivotal and very important weapon, but they weren't being mounted in large numbers on other vehicles like aircraft. In 1943, they started putting these on tanks, started with the IS-2. After the war, they would become much more common on armored vehicles. They would become the turret-mounted anti-aircraft gun for most Soviet tanks. So by now, today, this gun has gone out of production. It's been replaced by first the NSV and then the Cord 50 caliber machine guns. But over 1 million of these have been produced now. But the overwhelming majority of those were during the Cold War. So DshK production was licensed out to a couple other countries as well as being done in the Soviet Union. and they're all over the place now. But they were really kind of scarce guns, or much more limited guns during the Second World War, which is, of course, the time period that this one dates to. Sorry, quick break there, because I realized I really ought to put the armored shield on this thing. We have it, and man, it just makes it look even cooler. So hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. This is an extremely rare piece to find in the United States, registered, transferable, and in its original 1938 pattern. Thanks for watching.